The laundromat on Garnet Street smelled like dryer sheet and old coffee. The kind of smell that settles into the back of your throat and stays there long after you've left. Outside, the November wind was doing what November wind in Winnipeg always does. Cutting through everything, not caring what it finds on the other side. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed with that particular frequency that makes your temples ache if you sit under them long enough. Most people didn't notice anymore. The regulars never did. Stella Marchand noticed everything that night. She was 38 years old, and had been running on 4 hours of sleep for the better part of 2 weeks. Her daughter, Phoebe, had been sick. Nothing serious, the doctor had said, just one of those chest colds that take forever to loosen their grip on a child's small body. But Stella had spent 11 nights listening through the thin wall between their bedrooms, waking at every cough, every shift in breathing, every silence that lasted a half-second too long. She was the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fully fix. She'd dragged 2 garbage bags of laundry to the laundromat after Phoebe finally fell asleep, leaving her with Mrs. Corhanen next door, who was 71 and still kept the sharpest eyes on the block. The deal was simple. Stella would be back in 90 minutes. She had exactly enough change for 2 loads. She'd counted it 3 times before leaving the apartment. The laundromat was nearly empty. A teenager in headphones sat with his feet up, on a plastic chair near the back, scrolling his phone without looking up. A woman Stella didn't recognize was folding a mountain of towels by the window, working steadily, efficiently, like she'd done it 10,000 times. The machine in the far corner was broken again. There was a piece of masking tape over the coin slot, with the word sorry written in black marker, which Stella thought was oddly polite for a busted washing machine. She loaded the first machine, fed it quarters, and sat down to wait. There wasn't much else to do. She'd forgotten her book, her phone was at 11%. And she didn't want to drain it in case Mrs. Corhanen called. So she just sat there in a plastic chair, under the buzzing lights, and let herself be still for a moment. Which was something she almost never allowed herself anymore. It hadn't always been like this. 2 years ago, she and her ex-husband Derek had split. Not dramatically, not with fighting or betrayal or any of the things that make for a clean story. They had simply run out of whatever had held them together. Quietly and without ceremony, like a candle burning down to nothing. Phoebe was 4 then. She was 6 now. She still asked sometimes why Daddy lived somewhere else, and Stella always answered the same way. Because sometimes people love each other better from a distance. She wasn't sure if that was true. It was just the gentlest sentence she'd been able to find. Derek paid what he was supposed to pay and not $1 more. Which was technically correct and practically insufficient. Stella worked 32 hours a week at a dental office on McPhillips, scheduling appointments and managing the front desk. She was good at it. She was good at making things work on paper that barely worked in real life. The apartment was small but warm. Phoebe had her own room. There was always food in the fridge. Even if it wasn't always the food Stella would have chosen. But November had been cruel. The car needed a belt replaced. Phoebe's cold had meant 2 missed days of daycare, which meant 2 days Stella had to scramble for coverage, which had cost her. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, she'd miscalculated the budget by $60. $60. That were supposed to cover this week's groceries, but had quietly disappeared into the gap between what she thought she had and what she actually had. She was still trying to figure that part out when the door to the laundromat swung open and let in a gust of cold air, along with a man who looked like he hadn't slept much either. He was maybe 40, solidly built, with dark circles under his eyes and the kind of jaw that needs a shave every 12 hours. He was wearing a canvas work jacket with a small logo on the chest. Something to do with heating and cooling, Stella gathered, though she couldn't read it from where she sat. He was carrying a duffel bag over one shoulder and a boy on his other arm. A small kid who couldn't have been more than 5. Already half asleep, his head resting against the man's neck like a boat settling against a dock. The man scanned the laundromat quickly. A habit, Stella recognized, the same reflex she had of reading a room before fully committing to it, and then chose a machine 2 down from hers. He set the duffel on the folding table, lowered the boy into a chair with practiced gentleness, and then began sorting laundry with one hand while keeping the other on the boy's back so he didn't tip sideways in his sleep. Stella looked away. It felt private, what she was watching. Her first machine finished. She moved the clothes to a dryer, counted out her remaining quarters, and started the second load. When she sat back down, the man was still sorting, still keeping one hand on the sleeping boy, working quietly in the way that people who are used to doing everything alone learn to work. His name was Curtis Halverson, though Stella wouldn't know that until later. Curtis had been a single father for 14 months. Not as long as some. Long enough that he'd stopped counting the days the way you count days in the early weeks, when everything still feels like a temporary emergency. His wife, Renee, had died of an aneurysm on a Saturday morning in September of the previous year. She'd been making pancakes. The boy whose name was Theo. No, wait, the name had to be different. The file said Theo was taken. The boy whose name was Bram had been sitting at the kitchen table drawing with crayons when it happened. Curtis didn't talk about that part, not to anyone. He'd learned that most people want the version of grief they can respond to. The version that fits inside a condolence card. The real version was something else. Something that didn't fit anywhere, that you just carried around inside you like a stone in a coat pocket. Always there, always present. Always a little heavier than you remembered. He'd taken on extra shifts through the summer. Too many probably, because work was the one place where he still knew exactly what he was supposed to do. A broken furnace is a broken furnace. You find the problem, you fix it, you move on. He wished the rest of life worked the same way. Bram had started kindergarten in September and had been doing okay. Which was the word Curtis used, because he couldn't think of a better one. Okay, considering, given the circumstances. Tonight they'd been at Curtis's mother's place for dinner. And somewhere between leaving her house and getting home, Bram had knocked over a full cup of apple juice directly onto the bag of clean laundry that was supposed to last them the week. Curtis had stood in the hallway of their apartment, staring at the wet clothes for a long moment, doing the calculation. And then he'd put Bram back in his jacket and driven to the laundromat on Garnet because it was the closest one still open. He fed the machine and ran out of quarters, $2 short. He checked his wallet again, checked his jacket pockets, found a gas station receipt, a chapstick, and a single dime. He stood there for a moment, looking at the machine, and then he sat down on the bench next to Bram and rubbed his face with both hands. Stella had been watching without meaning to. She knew that posture. She had worn it herself so many times that she recognized it on a stranger the way you recognize a word in a foreign language you once almost learned. She hesitated. There was a version of herself, the version that was $60 short on groceries and running on 4 hours of sleep and had exactly enough quarters left for her own dryer, that stayed in her seat. That version was practical, understandable. Nobody could have blamed her. But there was another version, the version that had been on the receiving end of quiet kindness before. The neighbor who had once showed up at her door with a casserole and a $20 bill in an envelope. No explanation. No return address on the envelope. Even though Stella knew exactly who it was from. The woman at the daycare who had quietly floated Stella through a week when the e-transfer hadn't cleared in time. Who had just shrugged and said, "Pay me when you can," and then never brought it up again. Stella reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small Ziploc bag of quarters she'd been carrying since Tuesday when she'd started playing the laundry run. She counted out 8 of them in her palm. $2. She walked over and held them out without making a thing of it. "For the machine," she said. "I think you're short." Curtis looked up. He looked like a man who was ready to deflect, to say no thank you, to do the thing that pride asks you to do in moments like these. But then something in his face changed. He looked at her hand, and then at her, and the deflection didn't come. "I'll pay you back," he said. "You really don't have to," she said, and she meant it. He took the quarters. He stood up, fed them into the machine, pressed the button. The machine lurched and began to fill. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, looking at it, and Stella thought she saw his shoulders drop about an inch. The way shoulders do when something that's been held tight finally gets to let go. She went back to her seat. Neither of them spoke for a while. Bram slept in his chair, his mouth slightly open, one small hand curled under his chin. The teenager in the back had changed playlists and was nodding his head very slightly. The woman with the towels finished folding and left with a nod at no one in particular. It was Curtis who broke the silence first, not with anything significant. He just asked if the dryer in the far corner was actually broken, or if it just looked broken. Stella told him it had been broken for 3 weeks, that she'd complained to the owner, that the masking tape sorry sign was apparently the owner's idea of a solution. Curtis made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. They talked the way people talk in laundromats at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday in November, in short bursts, about small things, with spaces in between. He mentioned that Bram had started kindergarten. She mentioned that Phoebe was just getting over a cold. He said his mother made him take a bag of Ukrainian Christmas cookies every time he left her house, even when it wasn't anywhere near Christmas. Stella said that sounded like something her grandmother used to do, pressing food into people's hands at the door. Like she was afraid you'd starve on the walk to your car. At some point, without either of them quite deciding to, They had moved their chairs slightly so they were at a better angle to talk. Bram woke up around the 45-minute mark, the way small children sometimes do, completely, suddenly, without any of the gradual surfacing that adults go through. He looked around the laundromat with enormous clear eyes, taking in the machines, the lights, the stranger sitting 2 chairs down from his father. "Hi," he said to Stella, with the directness that 5-year-olds reserve for strangers they've decided are okay. "Hi," she said back, "my name is Bram. Like the author." Curtis looked faintly mortified. "We've been reading a lot of books lately," he said to Stella. "Bram Stoker," Bram clarified, as though Stella might be confused about which Bram he meant. "I know who Bram Stoker is," Stella said. Bram seemed satisfied with this. He climbed into his father's lap, considered Stella for another moment and then said, "Are you by yourself, Bram?" Curtis started. "My friend Ollie's mom is by herself too," Bram said. "She has a dog though. Do you have a dog?" "I have a daughter," Stella said. "She's 6. She's home sleeping." Bram thought about this. "Does she like dogs?" "She loves dogs. We just can't have one in our apartment." Bram nodded seriously, as though filing this away for future reference. Then he leaned back against his father's chest and went quiet, watching the dryer spin with the focused attention that children give to things that adults have long since stopped seeing. Curtis caught Stella's eye over the top of Bram's head and mouthed, "Sorry." She shook her head. It was fine. It was more than fine actually. There was something about this child. His directness, his gravity, the way he had said, "I'm Bram," like the author, that had pulled something loose in Stella's chest. She thought about Phoebe, asleep in Mrs. Cornyn's living room, and felt the particular ache of wanting to be in 2 places at once, that seems to be the permanent condition of every parent she had ever known. The dryers finished around the same time. They folded their laundry at adjacent tables. A strange domestic parallel. 2 people who had arrived alone ending up in the same rhythm of folding and sorting and stacking. Bram helped his father with the small items, the socks and the face cloths, with the solemn concentration of someone performing an important task. When everything was packed up, Curtis reached into his wallet and held out $2. "The quarters," he said. Stella looked at the 2 loonies in his hand. She thought about the $60 gap in her grocery budget. She thought about the masking tape sign on the broken machine. Apologizing for something it couldn't help. She thought about the woman who had once left her an envelope with no return address on it. She thought about what it felt like to be handed something without being asked to account for it. "Keep it," she said. "Get Bram a hot chocolate on the way home or something." Curtis opened his mouth to argue, and Stella could see him doing the same calculation she had done an hour earlier. Pride on one side, grace on the other. He looked down at Bram, who was looking up at him with those clear, serious eyes. "What do you say we get hot chocolate?" Curtis said. "Yes," Bram said without hesitation. Curtis put the loonies back in his wallet. He looked at Stella. "Thank you," he said, and he said it the way people say things when they mean more than the words themselves carry. "Don't worry about it," she said. And then, because it felt true, and she wanted to say something true. "You're doing great, you know, I can tell." He didn't say anything to that. He just nodded once, and she saw in his face the particular expression of someone who doesn't hear that very often, and isn't quite sure what to do with it when they do. They walked out into the November night together, then went their separate ways in the parking lot. Him toward a gray pickup truck, her toward the bus stop on the corner. She watched the truck pull out, watched the red taillights blur slightly in the cold air, and then turned up her collar against the wind. She was almost at the bus stop when she heard quick footsteps behind her on the pavement. She turned. It was Curtis, jogging slightly, his duffel over one shoulder. "I forgot to ask your name," he said, a little breathless. "Stella," she said. "Curtis." He held out his hand, and she shook it, which felt oddly formal and also exactly right. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which turned out to be the back of a Tim Hortons receipt. He'd written something on it inside the laundromat, she realized. She hadn't noticed him do it. "I know this is a bit odd," he said, "but I have a buddy who runs the food bank over on Selkirk. They've got a program right now, grocery pickup, no registration, no questions. Just show up Thursday between 4 and 6. He paused. "I noticed you counting quarters. I count quarters too. I just thought, if it would help." Stella looked at the receipt. There was an address written on it, neat block letters, the way people write when they want to make sure you can actually read it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "Neither did you." He gave her a small tired smile. Then he went back to his truck, and Stella stood at the bus stop with the receipt in her hand, the wind pulling at her hair, the Winnipeg November doing what it always does. Cold and indifferent and somehow, tonight, bearable. On Thursday afternoon, she showed up on Selkirk Avenue at 4:10. She almost didn't go. She told herself 3 times that morning that she didn't need to go, that she was managing, that $60 was not the kind of problem that required asking for help. She went anyway, because the practical part of her brain, the part that balanced spreadsheets and counted quarters, and made things work on paper that barely worked in real life, told her that pride was a luxury she could afford less than groceries. The woman at the door was calm and matter of fact, the way people are when they've made it their business to make other people feel normal. She didn't ask for registration or documentation. She handed Stella a box. In the box were things Stella actually needed. Pasta, canned tomatoes, a jar of peanut butter, a container of oats, a small jar of honey. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of brown paper, were 4 single-serving hot chocolates. The Swiss Miss kind with the little marshmallows. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Stella carried the box home on the bus, holding it on her lap, and when she got home Phoebe was awake and feeling better and wanted to know what was in the box, and could she have some? Please, what's that? Is that hot chocolate? Can we have hot chocolate, Mummy, can we? They made hot chocolate together at the kitchen counter. Phoebe standing on her step stool stirring with a wooden spoon with absolute seriousness, the way Bram had folded socks in the laundromat. Like it was the most important thing happening anywhere in the world at that exact moment. Stella thought about Curtis and Bram getting hot chocolate on a Wednesday night in November, driving home through the dark in a gray pickup truck with clean laundry in the back. She thought about the woman who had once left her an envelope with no return address. She thought about the way Bram had said, "I'm Bram," like the author, to a stranger in a laundromat without hesitation, as though the world was a place where it was perfectly reasonable to introduce yourself to someone and expect kindness in return. Maybe it was. Outside, the wind was still going, but inside, there was hot chocolate, and a child who felt like sunshine, and a box of groceries sitting on the kitchen counter like a quiet and undeniable fact. That people, even when they are exhausted, even when they are stretched thin and counting quarters and running on 4 hours of sleep, will sometimes turn toward each other instead of away. Phoebe finished stirring and held the spoon up for inspection. "Is that enough?" she asked. Stella looked at the mug, and at her daughter, and at the small warm kitchen that was theirs. "Yeah," she said. "That's enough."